Feeding Time. A short horror story. Written by Michael van der Voort. Narrated by Robin Reads. The lions weren't hungry that Monday. Not that it was any of my business. It had nothing to do with me that time. That time it was all down to Pima. Well, Pima and his father. To a lot of folks, the idea that lions could ever be not hungry seems absurd. People get raised on a diet of natural history specials and expect the lions to behave like they do on the screen, like they're going to be these wild beasts that are ravenous all of the time. Really, it ain't like that. In the wild, lions sometimes only eat twice a week, so they're used to going days without a meal. It's just that when they do eat, they have a hell of a big meal. When folks see the feeding times at the zoo, it should really only be called snack time. The lions get other regular feeds that the punters don't see before the park even opens. Plus, if I'm on shift on the right night between feeds, they get some extra top-up treats from me. I've got it so that they know me, and they come to expect it. I feed them at the proper time, too. I bring the stuff up in my old van and just carry it straight through the back entrance. People think, 'cause they see the lions chasing zebra in broad daylight on the Discovery Channel, that that's normal, but it ain't. Lions are mostly nocturnal, see? Like a lot of the critters here, they only really come alive at night. That's why when you see them in the daytime, they're mostly just lying around and scratching their balls and whatnot. It's their sleep time. In the wild, lions are like me. They prefer the night. They like to eat and hunt and whatnot at night. That's why, when I can, I like to slip them something extra at night, because it's more natural for them. And because it sends that purse-lipped idiot winch into a panic if they don't eat properly the following morning when their regular time comes up. It's always fun to watch him getting his knickers in a twist. Anyway, listen to me rattling on like I'm Diane Fossey or that Attenberg fella. I ain't no naturalist. I'm just the janitor. Winch loved saying that. "Thanks, Bill," he'd say, with his snooty little nose in the air, that precious little smirk on his face. "But remember, you're just the janitor." Yeah, I thought, just a janitor who sees more money and more lovely ladies than you ever will, sonny. Not only that, but I know more about most of these animals than those stuck-up preppy kids with their zoology degrees and whatnot. You should see 'em, cocky bastards, wafting round the place like they're Dr. Dolittle. It's partly why I moved to the night shift, to get away from their preppy smiles and their clipboards. That, and the quiet. Don't get me wrong, the night shift can be hard work, especially 'cause the day shift think we only exist to fill out the corners they cut in the daytime, but it beats the hell out of being around the punters. I swear some of them are filthier than the animals, but I learnt a lot on the night shift. A lot of it from Pima. It's probably fair to say that I liked Pima from the moment I met him. He'd been put in the job by some agency that were apparently given a hefty sum of money to the zoo in exchange for having workers they nominated given legit placements. It was dodgy as hell, but hey, it paid well and probably covered the cost of that gorilla experience nonsense the director was always banging on about. Pima and I had first met after a staff meeting. Millstone made some cock-handed attempt to introduce him as my new partner in crime and explained that he was Chinese. No sooner had the words left Millstone's sneery little mouth than Pima had stuffed them right back in again. "Not Chinese, Tibetan," he'd snapped. Millstone had looked stunned for a second. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially by a foreign worker. Those preppy types are always closet racists in my experience. She coughed and had narrowed her eyes at Pima. "Well," she smirked, checking her clipboard as if it were a crystal ball and contained all of recorded history. "Says here you're Chinese, and last I checked, Tibet was in China." Pima's face hardened. "I don't care what it says on your papers. I'm Tibetan. Don't call me Chinese again." Millstone looked from her board to me and seemed displeased by my enormous grin, which only made it get bigger. I loved it. Anyone willing to talk back to the bosses like that on day one was okay in my book. "Welcome to the team," I said, slapping him on the back. In truth, the team, up to that point, had been just me. I don't mind telling you that at first, when they said they were making my one-man job into a two-man one, I worried it would interrupt my privacy. As it turned out, it just meant the job was done quicker. You see, the other upside of working nights, on top of there being no preppies and no punters, is the quiet. If you're a grafter like me and Pima were, and you're happy to go full throttle, you can have your portion of the place spick and span in just over 3 hours, less in winter, when there's fewer punters. A few of the guys from the day shift would say that Pima was odd-looking on account of the scars on his face and him only having 3 fingers on his left hand. Others called him the monk because of his bald head and a habit of wearing a big orange scarf that looked like a robe no matter what the weather. To me, his looks didn't matter. After all, I was what people might call odd-looking too, having inherited my dad's hair and my mum's bug eyes. Not that it ever stopped me being able to pick up the lovely ladies, you understand. Some of the guys used to joke that they called me Grease Willie on account of the way I swept my hair over the bald spot. I didn't mind. Let 'em laugh. One day, one of the lovely ladies on Willie's list might just be one of their mums. Let's see how they laugh then. As for Pima, I could give one what he looked like. He was quiet and thoughtful, and he fit into the routine I'd established perfectly. Best of all, he knew there was no medal for working too hard and recognised the value of knowing when to keep his mouth shut. We were a good team and had our routine down like clockwork. We'd come in at the start of the shift and, as agreed, work like demons for 3 hours, splitting up to cover more ground. Once we were done, we would meet back at the maintenance office. Sometimes I'd get there first, sometimes he would. That boy could work. What you would have then is acres of night. Big black vistas of time where you could sit on your arse in the maintenance room and think, or get on with whatever other projects you had going. For me, it was the cards, the horses, and thinking about lovely ladies. For Pima, it was the zen. Not that he ever called it that was just my name for what he got up to. Eventually, he taught me to combine his zen with my pursuits. Once he did that, we were unstoppable. Pima's zen time, as I called it, started around a week after we'd gotten our routine sorted. Once the work was done, he'd come back to the office, pull up a little rug and sit cross-legged on the floor. His back would be perfectly straight, and then he'd just sit, meditating like that for hours. It was as if someone had come into the room and placed a wooden idol there. Every now and again he'd break posture to take a swig from the thermos of tea he always had with him. Then he would calmly place his hands back into his lap, retake the position and carry on. One time there was a storm blowing a gale overhead. Really, we shouldn't have been there, even on the way in. There were trees and telephone poles blown over. I mean, it was serious stuff. I finished second that night, and when I got back to the maintenance room, Pima was already there. Technically, he was outside, sitting on the cement veranda area under the awning of the tiled roof. He often took this position when it was raining because he enjoyed the sound. That night, though, the sound was deafening and water was spraying everywhere. I was at a loss to explain how Pima wasn't already soaked. As I approached the hut and called him to come inside, a roof tile the size of your forearm came unfastened in the wind. From my vantage point, the thing seemed to fall in slow motion. There was a part of me that knew as it fell that it would kill him. The weight of the heavy terracotta slab would smash his skull. I screamed and lurched forward. The tile landed with an enormous crash that sounded like a gunshot and shattered into 100 pieces. Had it hit him, it would have killed him. As it was, it had landed behind him. I swear to God it missed his bald head by 1/4 of an inch. Pima didn't notice. He never moved a muscle. I'd always thought that you needed silence for that kind of thing, but it turned out I was wrong. When I said that the night shift was quiet, I meant there was nobody about. The actual volume was louder than the daytime. Most of the animals do their eating, sexing, and fighting at night. The whole place would be alive with whooping and hollering and who knows what else. You'd think it would be hard to meditate like that. As it turned out, Pima liked it. Being at the zoo was as close as he could get to being surrounded by, or immersed in, nature. He said the noises made him feel like he was part of everything. At first, I thought he was nuts. Then he showed me. When Pima offered to teach me his Zen the first time, I laughed. I knew that neither my sensible head or creaky knees were going to allow me to sit on the floor with my legs folded up like some damn pretzel. Pima just smiled. In all the time I knew him, I never heard him laugh, but he seemed to be constantly smiling, even when meditating. He explained that I didn't need to be on lotus position, or Pima position, as he called it. Apparently, Pima is Tibetan for lotus. I don't know, it was his idea of a joke. The Zen was just a state of mind where you were completely focused, totally in the zone to the exclusion of everything else. It could be active. He said that rock climbers, swimmers, and martial artists do it. They enter a state of mind like tunnel vision, where all that exists is the present action. Which grip to take next, which foot to put where. A few days later he sat with me before I started my nightly foray into the online poker groups and betting on British horse racing. They race whilst we were awake at night. He told me that before I started I should do some deep breathing and mumbo-jumbo and centre myself. I went along with it to humour him and started playing. Up to that point, it was my single most successful night ever. Just like he'd said, I felt fluid, as if I had somehow melted into the screen and existed in the game. I could see all the cards, all the possibilities, work out the odds in an instant. The zoo, the maintenance room, even thoughts of lovely ladies, everything else melted away. The whole world was present tense. Over the next year, I made 8 times my salary playing poker at night. The extra income helped me rope in a few more lovely ladies, and I even got good enough to be able to do it on the days Pima wasn't working and I was on shift alone. I was Zen. The first time Pima mentioned his father was the same day I found him in the lion enclosure. I'd been surprised when I arrived not to find him waiting by the gate as usual, thermos gripped in his 3 fingers and orange scarf around his neck. I figured maybe he was late. A few hours later, he still hadn't showed. We kept in touch by walkie-talkie, but mine had been silent since I'd come on shift. I remember the first part of the shift clearly. Some kid had decided to do a modern art piece in doo-doo all over the wall of one of the bathroom stalls, and, having elected not to deal with it, the day shift had left the mess to harden, making it all the harder for yours truly to chip off. Like I said, I've seen some of it in my time. As I imagined shoving the kid responsible's head down the john and giving him a whirly he'd never forget, I began to worry about Pima. He was never late and never missed a shift. Little did I know I was about to get a whole lot more worried. On one wall of the maintenance room was a series of screens. These showed a live CCTV feed from cameras in this part of the park. In theory, this was a security measure. In practice, the technology was prehistoric. The animals had state-of-the-art stuff on their enclosures, and here we were still messing around with VHS tapes. Tapes that were recorded over every night and never checked. I'd personally paused and recorded over sections when I felt like bringing in some extra tidbits for the lions. No one ever asked, no one ever monitored. For some reason, though, on that night, I checked. It was more of a glance, really. An upturn of the eyes toward the screens, but I instantly noticed. In one of the isolation pens for the lions was Brutus, the big male, laying on his side. In the corner of the paddock, sitting cross-legged in some straw, was Pima. I felt my blood freeze. I sprinted from the room toward the pen. The cell was around 3 meters square. Against one wall, his back to Pima, Brutus lay sleeping, his huge haunches rising and falling with each massive breath. Somehow, despite my panic, I managed to think far enough ahead not to storm toward the pen and disturb the massive male. Instead, I opened the iron door on the far wall. Pima was seated in the corner along the same wall, Brutus against the wall opposite. I hissed through my teeth, my throat dry and papery with fear. "Pima, what in Christ's name are you doing? Are you insane? Get up now!" Pima slowly turned his head and smiled. He lifted one hand listlessly and gestured toward the lion. "He's dying," he said bluntly. I stared over at Brutus, at his massive head and huge, thick mane now resting in rich chestnut locks against the beige painted surfaces. He was still, sure. Sleeping? Probably. But dying? There was no way of telling from here, and even if there were, it still wouldn't warrant entering the enclosure. Even in my position with only my head peeking in from behind the heavy steel gate, I was closer than I was comfortable being. Suddenly, with a single movement I still don't understand the physics of, Pima got up from a cross-legged seated position to standing without using his hands. I beckoned him to come out, reluctant to raise my voice for fear of startling the lion. To my horror, Pima began walking slowly toward Brutus. As a betting man, I knew that with every step he took toward the big male, Pima's odds of escape got shorter. With every gentle, deliberate step he took, I allowed my hand to inch a little closer to the Luger I had strapped to my hip. Having a gun on the premises was strictly against company policy and could lead to instant dismissal, but to be fair, if one of those big critters got out of his cage, which has happened in other zoos, then company policy wouldn't be there to save me. I always figured that in that situation I'd worry more about having a fireable weapon than committing a fireable offence. I'd never actually expected to have to use it. Pima, again, sank into a seated position, inches from Brutus. I took out my gun and aimed it at the lion's head, though, again, as a betting man, I didn't much fancy my chances of killing him before he got to Pima. "Pima, for the last time, get out of there. Just move back slowly." I eased the steel door open and stepped into the pen, never once taking my eyes from Brutus, who still seemed to be dozing or adjusting my aim from his massive cranium. For a moment, I worried that in such a small space, even if I had hit Brutus, the bullet might bounce. I edged closer to Pima. If he'd lost his mind and wouldn't come, I decided I'd drag the stupid git out myself, even if I had to throttle him. "Let me show you something." Pima raised his hand and, to my utter disbelief, placed it gently on the lion's mane, running the soft fur through his fingers like he was petting a Labrador. "Pima!" I hissed through my teeth. "He's lost his mind," I thought. "All that meditating has sent him mad." I glanced at Pima's hand and watched as Brutus's massive head turned towards him. The eyes were a blazing orange and fixed upon him, and then, in an instant, went glassy. It was as if someone had hit pause or had unplugged a machine halfway through an action. Pima stared back at Brutus and shushed him as one might quieten a baby to sleep. There was a stiffening, a final exhalation, and a stench as his bowels released. Brutus was gone, and in a way that felt more physical than I can describe, I had watched him go. Pima stood, stooped to stroke Brutus's fur, then turned and strolled past me through the door. I followed and spent the next hour rewinding and erasing the videotape. I didn't speak to Pima. I suppose I was in shock and responded to the adrenaline by becoming businesslike and efficient. The tape, I thought. That's the priority now. After a while, Pima spoke. He talked about Brutus's body, about how now that sack of fur, muscle, and sinew was just an empty shell. How all the essence of what had been that creature was gone to some other place. Having watched as the spark left Brutus, I found myself believing him, but still I didn't respond. Just watched Pima's grainy image on the screen walking in reverse back to a seated position away from the lion. "Our bodies are like cars," he said. "The soul is the driver. We make it move, give it life. When the car stops working or is damaged in an accident, it doesn't affect the driver. We get out and find a new car. We give life to a new machine. At that point, the old car loses what gave it life. It is no better than scrap. An empty shell. Like our bodies. Like Brutus." I didn't respond. I was already wondering how Winch was going to react when he found out Brutus had died in the night, wondering what they would do with the body. Pima went on. Seeing something die, you see that the soul is separate, that the body after death is useless. I half listened as I rewound the tape again, wondering if they would check them and thanking my lucky stars that there were no timestamps on the recording like there were in the cafeteria. I'm glad that you saw that, Bill. Glad you saw the difference between Brutus's body before and his body after. I'm glad because there was a long pause, because I need your help. For the first time, I turned to look at Pima and realized he was crying. If you ever find yourself in easy reach of a computer with half an hour to spare or have to do a long commute and have internet on your phone, try looking up Tibetan sky burial. I promise I ain't making this stuff up. In many Tibetan communities, the standard method for disposing of the dead is to give the body to the birds, literally. They take the body up into the mountains, where a specially chosen guy hacks it into pieces. Those hefts of meat are then left for the animals, usually griffin vultures, huge birds with enormous wingspans, to descend upon and devour. In less than an hour there is nothing left. It sounds gruesome, but to them it is about showing that the body, the shell that houses the soul, is not important. Once the soul departs, it's just meat. The sky burial allows the deceased to give something back to the earth. That's why Brutus was important. It was a preface. For Pima, it was necessary for me to see the difference between the living flesh and the carcass. It was a preface to what he had to ask. My father, he began, is Tibetan. He came to this country in 1948 at the age of 8 with his parents, fleeing the changes that were occurring in Tibet. Both my grandparents and my 2 uncles died before reaching here, my aunt a few years after. My father learnt to speak English, got a job working in a restaurant in Chinatown, and eventually saved enough money to open his own small business. Over the years, his business expanded, and eventually he had enough money to afford a place and marry my mother. Real American dream stuff, I said in a way that sounded rougher than I meant it. He is, Pima said, swiping tears from his eyes with the back of his hand. On paper, he's American. But in his bones, in his soul, he's a Tibetan. The mention of the word soul made me feel uneasy, and I thought again of Brutus's eyes, of that light that slowly dimmed and then went out of the thing that was there and then wasn't. My father is very sick. He's in a lot of pain. He wants to die and to pass on like a Tibetan. At first I didn't understand. Then Pima explained the sky burial to me. Even before he had finished, I knew what he wanted me to do. Took me a week to think over what he was asking. I knew that it was possible. I also knew it was illegal. Very illegal. Question was it right? On the 7th day, I was sitting in the maintenance room and overheard Pima talking on the phone. I heard him tell someone to put his father on line, and heard him trying to comfort him. From the other end of the line I heard wails and cries. Cries, I knew, of agony. Yes, it was right. Yes, I would do it. A week later, on a Sunday, Pima and I rode into work together in my old van. Earlier that afternoon, respecting his wishes, Pima had ended his father's life. I'd been waiting outside in the van. We loaded the body, wrapped in a blanket, from the back door and into the van. No one saw us. What Pima did seemed to me to be a mercy, but it would also send him to prison for a long time if anyone found the evidence, if they ever found the body. Pima showed me a note, handwritten by his father, that begged for death and for a sky burial, for his body to be given back. We didn't have enough vultures at the zoo, but we did have lions. Watching Pima trying to remain stoic as we cut up the body in the kitchen was difficult. His belief said that he shouldn't be attached, especially now, when this was just meat. But belief is one thing, reality another. I stayed silent as we did it, allowing him to remain silent too, fearing that if I forced him to speak, I'd hear his voice quiver and crack. The lions made short work of the meat and much of the bone. Pima said prayers as they chewed, and I remained silent. I knew that we would never speak of this again, but as I watched the grisly scene, horrendous as it was, I felt somewhat of a shift within me, a spiritual moment of acceptance and relief. What remnants there were left we retrieved after having penned the lions off and given them an unexpected stroll outside. What we gathered, we either fed to the hyenas or collected for Pima to grind up and throw into the river the next day. When we'd finished, I jet-sprayed the enclosures so no zoo intern or volunteer stumbled over remains, though, to be honest, who'd think twice of finding bloodstains or remains in a lion's cage? The next day, the lions weren't hungry. That Tuesday, Pima didn't show for work. I would say that I never saw him again, but that wouldn't be quite true. The next time I saw him was on the news. The image was a mugshot taken years back. The newsman said that the suspect was wanted in connection with the murder of a notorious gang boss. They showed a picture of the boss, and I recognised him too, though of course he looked different. The picture was taken while he was alive. I began to suspect that the body we'd cut up and fed to the lions, wasn't Pima's father at all. That the cries of pain I'd heard on the phone were not the result of chronic illness, and that Pima had lost his fingers in a less than conventional way. That perhaps Pima wasn't even Tibetan. But no one else suspected, so I stayed quiet. A promise is a promise. A few weeks later I received a letter from Pima. I kept that quiet too. After all, I'm quite good at keeping my cards close to my chest. The letter, sent to my home address, was something of an apology and something of a reassurance. He explained that his father was a cruel and ruthless boss, that his removal was necessary and the elaborate setup for the disposal of his body the only way to be sure. It explained that I'd never see Pima again, but also that there would be no investigation, no suspicion, and no follow-up. The matter was closed. His organisation, of which he was now head, put too much money into the zoo and the local police department for there to be a whiff of suspicion. I was protected, and I was safe. Some folks, I know, would be angry, would feel used and want to blab about this to the papers. But not me. Pima, unknowingly, had done me a favour. Now I'm also protected. If nobody asks about Pima, nobody asks about me, or about the other times, long before Pima arrived. No one will ask what happened to all those lovely ladies, or about the other times that the lions weren't hungry on a Monday. Speaking of which, I've a feeling they're ready for a feed. This has been Feeding Time, a short horror story, written by Michael Vandervoort, narrated by Robin Reads. Copyright 2023 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.